If you ever wanted to try being the engineer of a locomotive when you grew up, Train Sim World 2 is the game for you. Mastering the game will leave you feeling like a real train driver, but you have to be willing to endure a fair amount of frustration along the way. Train Sim World is composed of various train lines, 3 without any DLC, all of which have several tutorials, around 5 scripted scenarios, a freeform explore mode, and a large number of timetables that are basically just less unique scenarios. The tutorials, scenarios, and a decent chunk of the timetables get shuffled into a journey for each line, which basically serves as the intended way to play through the game. You can always do any of them at any time, however, even repeating them for a better score. Once you have left the menu and entered the game, you will be presented with a schedule of tasks to complete in a specified order, and in most cases by a specified time. Completing them accurately and on time earns you action points, which forms your score as well as leveling your character up. The levels don't appear to have any mechanical effect, they just make you feel good. The upside is that you always have some task to complete, but all the steps to actually accomplish a given task may not be listed on the schedule once you are outside the tutorial mode. The exception to this is the Explore mode, where instead of completing tasks, you are allowed to wander freely around the stations, board and drive trains, and attempt to find maps and posters that need to be put up, safety equipment in need of repair or replacement, and other menial tasks that happen instantly when you walk close enough to the target. You can also enter scenarios directly from this mode for an added bit of realism. There really aren't any moral issues in Train Sim World 2. While there are people milling about, and even a random co-worker in the train with you on Sandpatch Grade, they are all dressed in professional or business casual attire. There are fake ads throughout the London Underground, but none that I noticed seemed problematic. While the only consequences of speeding is gaining fewer action points, driving recklessly will end the scenario if you run a red light or derail the train. With so many scenarios and timetables to play, it's not hard to sink a lot of hours into this game. Just doing the first chapter of each journey took me 20 hours to complete, and they each have 2 more. Not to mention all the timetables that aren't in the journeys, and that you can create your own if you manage to run out of those. To take advantage of that value though, you really have to like driving trains. As far as I can tell, when on a given line you're doing more or less the same thing over and over again, with at most different weather conditions or starting and ending stops. There are a lot of lines you can add via DLC, but they each cost as much as the base game itself. For the most part, there is exactly one game mechanic in Train Sim World, speeding up and slowing down. Shockingly, that doesn't end up being nearly as boring as it sounds. Because each of the 3 lines included with the game are so different, I'm going to discuss them individually. On the Underground, you play the part of a passenger train driver, moving people throughout London. The train you are working in comes from 1972, and it certainly looks the part, both inside and out. The upshot is that the controls are very simple, just open and close the doors, and apply the correct amounts of power or brake. The downside is that there's only really one kind of task: drive from one station to the next, load more passengers, and repeat. The only reason to even get out of your chair is on the rare occasion you need to walk to the other end of the train to do the route in reverse. Repetitive as it is, this gameplay loop is actually pretty fun, especially because you're on a very tight schedule. So tight that once you start running a little behind, it's very hard to catch back up. Especially with stations only a few minutes apart at most, you're always having to pay attention. In Germany, you control much faster trains, going as fast as 250 kilometers an hour because the stations are so far apart. Besides greater distances and times between stops, the only real difference between this and the slower trains is that you have to start braking much sooner so you don't blow past the station. There are 2 trains to use, a commuter train that plays much like the Underground, and a high-speed, long-haul train that you only take between the 2 ends of the line. While you get to go very fast with that train, that's also about the only thing you do for the entirety of the half-hour trip. Weather also plays a larger factor here, as the setting is entirely outdoors. When it is snowing or raining, you have to be a bit more careful with how quickly you accelerate, or risk derailing the train. Even though Sandpatch Grade is presented first in the selection menu, do not play it first. While it does a good job of solving the just speed up and slow down repetition of the other lines, the extra complexity can be overwhelming. That said, here you're driving cargo trains in Pennsylvania, moving cars around a train yard, and loading coal before hauling it up the steepest hills in the game. Unfortunately, you're commonly doing so at a snail's pace, often going no more than 15 miles an hour. Even when you get to go faster, the winding route means that a given scenario can easily take several hours to complete. You also have to manage rail switches, multiple engines, and car coupling and uncoupling. There's a lot of steps to remember, and not all of them are told to you in-game, but it does a good job adding variety. Throughout the game, the detailed train models and stations make you feel like you are actually working on the railroad. Each of the trains in the base game has a distinct visual style, from sleek and modern to bare-bones industrial. Special attention was clearly given to the various control panels, as they have every knob, button, and dial you can imagine, all labeled, and for German trains, labeled in German. Some even have fully functional digital displays. The surroundings are equally realistic, both viewed from train windows and from the various external cameras you can use. The one complaint I have is that all the locales are totally nondescript. When in London, all you see besides dark tunnels and generic metro stations are cookie-cutter residential buildings. In Germany, you get a little bit of Gothic-looking architecture, but it could easily be anywhere in Europe. And in the US, it's just a very nice-looking patch of countryside. The lush hills and flowing rivers look nice, but could also be from quite a number of places along the East Coast. I would have loved to occasionally drive by a landmark, so it felt like I was in the location the game said I was. Basically, the visuals don't detract in any way from the game, but they don't enhance the experience either. The game generally does a poor job of telling you what might be wrong with the train at any given moment. It's not hard to get into a state where you're using the controls, but it just refuses to move. This is exacerbated by a frequent bug where the train state is not restored correctly when loading a saved game. At several points I had to just restart the scenario. With individual scenarios taking up to an hour or more, this was really frustrating. When in Explore mode, there's no indication where you have or haven't been, or what tasks each station has left to complete, if there are any. To have any chance of 100% completion, you have to methodically walk around every inch of every station. Additionally, due to the timetables for the trains, transferring between stations via train can take upwards of 5 minutes of just standing around, or restarting Explore mode from the main menu at the next stop. It may be realistic, but it isn't much fun to wait for a train. The other huge miss in the game comes in its instructions and tutorials. Even when labeled in English, much of the terminology is industry lingo, and so indecipherable if you aren't already a train driver. That wouldn't be so bad, except the game explains absolutely none of it. It tells you the basics so that you can move the train, but it's all just magic words. Adding to the confusion is the vast array of knobs and switches on each train, about half of which are interactive, and maybe 5% of which actually seem to do anything at all. It makes you feel like you're missing something, and the game would improve if it explained them or even required their use in a scenario. Of course, in the few instances where an unexplained control is required in a scenario, that fact is entirely undiscoverable apart from searching the internet. Even whole game mechanics, like flipping track switches from the map screen, go entirely unexplained. Adding to the control problems are the keyboard shortcuts. While using the mouse feels like the most realistic way to interact with the controls, when you're constantly having to adjust them, like the throttle and brakes, it means that you don't get to look at anything other than the control levers. Additionally, some of the control hitboxes that require keys, like the master switch on the underground, nearly completely overlap those for actually manipulating the switch once the key is in place. If you try to use the keyboard controls instead, they're unintuitive at best. A to speed up and D to slow down seems backwards, and I've never seen another game where the 9 key brings up the map screen. Even the controls screen in the menu isn't very helpful, as the keys are labeled with game concepts that don't necessarily line up word for word with any controls on the actual train you're driving. The keys also don't support remapping, so you're stuck with what the game gives you. On my programmable keyboard that uses semicolon as a layer toggle, that meant I couldn't control the brakes with anything but the mouse. The control issues were more annoying than anything, but they also seem like easy fixes for the developers that haven't happened. With no issues to speak of, Train Sim World 2 gets a perfect 5 out of 5 for morality. Quality is a tougher call. Overall gameplay is great, if lacking in variety, but bugs around restoring saved games, a lack of instruction in critical game mechanics, and hard-to-use controls brings it down to a 3 out of 5.